For more than 50 years, a dark truth was locked behind the doors of a family everyone thought was perfect. He was the admired spiritual leader, but at home, he hid addictions, violence, and a secret the congregation helped conceal. Today, Robert breaks the silence and reveals what they never wanted you to know. My name is Robert, and I'm 72 years old today. If you're listening to this story, know that every word I'm about to share comes from the deepest corners of my heart, places I've kept locked for decades. I've lived through something that changed not just my life, but my understanding of faith, family, and the dangerous power that religious authority can wield over vulnerable souls. I was born in 1951 in a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio, into what everyone considered a blessed family. My father, Daniel Morrison, was one of the most respected elders in our Kingdom Hall congregation. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of spiritual leadership, tall, commanding presence with a voice that could fill a room and make people hang on his every word during Thursday night meetings and Sunday services. When he spoke from the platform about spiritual discipline, about resisting worldly temptations, about maintaining purity in thought and deed, the congregation would nod in unanimous agreement, their faces glowing with admiration. But I knew a different Daniel Morrison, the one who stumbled through our front door at 3 a.m, reeking of alcohol and something else I couldn't identify as a child, but would later recognize as the sweet, acrid smell of marijuana. The one whose hands shook during our family Bible study sessions, whose eyes were often bloodshot and unfocused when he tried to explain scripture to me and my younger sister, Sarah. The one who would disappear for days at a time, leaving my mother, Ruth, to field concerned phone calls from congregation members asking about his whereabouts. My earliest memories are painted with the colors of contradiction. Sunday mornings were a carefully choreographed performance. My mother would wake up at dawn, ironing my father's suit while he locked himself in the bathroom for what seemed like hours. When he finally emerged, his transformation was remarkable. The trembling hands were steady, the bloodshot eyes had somehow cleared, and that commanding voice was back. We'd drive to the Kingdom Hall in our pristine station wagon, my father gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, my mother sitting ramrod straight beside him, and Sarah and I in the back seat, dressed in our best clothes, instructed never to speak unless spoken to. At the Kingdom Hall, my father was a different person entirely. He'd stride through those double doors with confidence, greeting brothers and sisters with firm handshakes and warm smiles. During meetings, when he was called upon to give talks or lead discussions, he was magnetic. I remember watching faces in the congregation light up when he spoke about the importance of family unity, about being examples in our community, about the spiritual battles we all faced against Satan's influence in the world. They had no idea that just hours before, this same man had been on his knees in our kitchen, begging my mother for money to buy his next fix. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, even for a child. At home, we walked on eggshells. My father's moods were unpredictable. One moment he'd be attempting to be the loving patriarch, reading Bible stories to us before bed, and the next he'd explode into violent rages over the smallest things. A glass of spilled milk could trigger a 30-minute tirade about respect and obedience. A question about homework could result in him storming out of the house, not returning for days. During these episodes, my mother would gather Sarah and me into her bedroom, and we'd sit in silence, listening to him throw furniture and punch walls, all while she whispered prayers under her breath. The official explanation for my father's frequent absences was always the same. He was attending special training sessions for elders, receiving advanced spiritual instruction from the circuit overseer, or participating in important congregation business that required travel. The congregation bought these explanations without question. After all, why would they doubt a spiritual leader? When he'd return after a week-long disappearance looking gaunt and shaky, the brothers would welcome him back with enthusiasm, asking about his training. and complimenting him on his dedication to spiritual growth. What they didn't know was that these absences were actually stays at rehabilitation facilities. My mother would drive him to these places in the dead of night, returning home with red, swollen eyes, and a story prepared for anyone who might ask. I was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but I knew the pattern. The escalating strange behavior, the desperate late-night phone calls my mother would make from the kitchen while she thought Sarah and I were asleep, the sudden departure, and then the return of a temporarily clean but spiritually broken man. As I grew older, I began to piece together the reality of our situation. My father wasn't just struggling with alcohol. His addiction was far more complex and destructive. I'd find small plastic bags hidden in his study, behind the copies of The Watchtower and Awake magazines that lined his bookshelves. There were prescription bottles with other people's names on them, strange metal implements I didn't recognize, and sometimes syringes hidden in his desk drawers. The man who stood before our congregation preaching about the evils of worldly pleasures was himself enslaved to substances that were destroying not just his body, but our entire family. The most painful part wasn't even his addiction. It was the systematic cover-up that surrounded it. Other elders in our congregation knew something was wrong. They had to. There were too many inconsistencies, too many last-minute cancellations, too many times when my father would show up to meetings clearly under the influence of something. But instead of addressing the problem directly, they created an elaborate system of protection around him. When congregation members started asking questions about his behavior, these elders would quickly redirect the conversation, praising my father's spiritual battles and asking for prayers for his health challenges. This is the story I need to tell you, dear friends. It's not just about one man's addiction, though that's certainly part of it. It's about how religious institutions can become complicit in maintaining dangerous facades, how the desire to protect reputation can override the need to protect people, and how children like me and Sarah grew up learning that truth was less important than appearance. We learned that love was conditional, that worth was based on performance, and that questioning authority, even when that authority was clearly failing, was a sin greater than the failures themselves. The foundation of lies that my childhood was built upon would shape every relationship I'd have for decades to come. It would influence my understanding of God, of family, of what it meant to be a man of faith. And it would take me more than 50 years to finally find the courage to speak the truth that I'm sharing with you now. As I entered my teenage years in the mid-1960s, the contradictions in our household became impossible to ignore, yet somehow we all became more skilled at pretending they didn't exist. My father's addiction had evolved from something he tried to hide into something that required an entire support system of enablers, and tragically, my mother and I had become the primary architects of that system. The Kingdom Hall in our small Ohio town had grown larger by then, with nearly 200 active members attending our twice-weekly meetings. My father's reputation had grown along with the congregation. He was frequently invited to give talks at circuit assemblies, those larger gatherings where multiple congregations would come together to hear spiritual instruction. I remember sitting in those massive auditoriums, watching hundreds of people hang on his every word as he delivered passionate speeches about spiritual warfare, about resisting temptation, about the importance of maintaining Christian integrity in a corrupt world. The irony was so thick I could taste it, sitting there in my pressed shirt and tie, knowing that just that morning I had helped my mother clean up the vomit in his study after another night of what she euphemistically called his spiritual struggles. The other elders in our congregation had perfected the art of willful blindness. Brother Patterson, the presiding overseer, was a kind man in his 60s who had known our family since before I was born. When my father would miss important meetings or show up clearly impaired, Brother Patterson would take me aside afterward and ask how things were at home. But when I tried to hint at the truth, tried to explain that my father wasn't well, that he needed help, Brother Patterson would place his hand on my shoulder and say something like, "Your father is fighting battles that most of us can't understand, Robert. Satan attacks our strongest spiritual warriors the hardest. We must pray for him and trust in Jehovah's timing." It was as if there was a script everyone had memorized, a way of talking around the obvious truth without ever acknowledging it directly. Brother Williams, another elder who worked closely with my father on judicial committees that handled disciplinary matters in the congregation, had developed an even more elaborate system of protection. When congregation members would approach him with concerns about my father's behavior, Brother Williams would redirect their attention to my father's exceptional spiritual discernment and his deep understanding of Scripture. He would remind them of powerful talks my father had given, of families he had helped during difficult times, of his years of faithful service. Any suggestion that there might be problems was met with gentle but firm correction about the dangers of speaking against Jehovah's appointed shepherds. Meanwhile, at home, the reality was becoming increasingly dangerous. My father's drug use had progressed from pills and alcohol to harder substances. I was 16 when I first found him unconscious on the bathroom floor, a needle still hanging from his arm, his lips blue, and his breathing so shallow I thought he was dead. My mother arrived home from her part-time job at the local grocery store to find me performing CPR, something I had learned in health class just weeks before. Instead of calling an ambulance, instead of seeking immediate medical attention, her first instinct was to check the windows to make sure none of the neighbors could see into our house. We dragged my father to his bedroom, and my mother spent the next 4 hours bringing him back to consciousness with cold compresses and strong coffee, all while coaching me on what we would tell anyone who asked about his absence from the Thursday night meeting. The lies became more elaborate and more necessary as time went on. When my father would disappear for extended periods, my mother would call the Kingdom Hall and explain that he was suffering from a recurring back injury that required specialized treatment out of state. When he would show up to meetings with track marks on his arms, we would explain that he was receiving regular injections for a rare blood disorder. When his behavior during meetings became erratic or inappropriate, we would attribute it to the side effects of strong pain medications prescribed by his doctors. The congregation accepted these explanations with the kind of unquestioning faith that our religious training had taught us to apply to spiritual matters. But the most heartbreaking part of this deception was how it was corrupting me. By the age of 17, I had become an expert liar, able to craft believable stories on the spot to explain away my father's behavior. When schoolmates asked why my father, who was known in our small town as a religious leader, sometimes showed up to my school events clearly intoxicated, I would explain that he was taking prescription medication that made him drowsy. When teachers expressed concern about my frequent absences, which were usually the result of having to stay home to monitor my father during his worst episodes, I would provide detailed explanations about my own fictional health problems. I was learning that love meant lying, that protecting people meant hiding the truth, and that maintaining appearances was more important than addressing real problems. The psychological toll on our family was devastating. My mother, Ruth, had transformed from the vibrant woman I remembered from my early childhood into a hollow shell who moved through her days in a state of constant anxiety. She would check on my father obsessively, monitoring his breathing while he slept, searching his pockets and belongings for drugs or paraphernalia, counting the money in her purse to see how much he had stolen. She stopped singing the kingdom songs that had once filled our house during her daily chores. She stopped laughing at television shows or jokes. She stopped making eye contact during conversations, as if she was afraid that people might see the truth in her eyes if she looked at them directly. My sister Sarah, who was 3 years younger than me, dealt with the chaos by retreating into herself almost completely. She became an obsessive student, spending hours in her room with her homework and her books, emerging only for meals and meetings. She stopped bringing friends home from school, stopped participating in the social activities that were acceptable within our religious community, and developed a stutter that became more pronounced whenever my father was in the room. At night, I would sometimes hear her crying through the thin walls of our small house, but when I tried to talk to her about what was happening, she would insist that everything was fine, that we just needed to pray harder for our father's health to improve. The most disturbing aspect of this period was how my father's addiction was actually enhancing his effectiveness as a religious leader in some ways. His talks became more passionate, more emotional, as if his personal struggles were feeding into his spiritual presentation. When he spoke about the battle between good and evil, about the constant temptation that Christians faced in a corrupt world, about the need for complete surrender to God's will, his words carried a weight and authenticity that resonated powerfully with the congregation. People would approach him after meetings, tears in their eyes, telling him how his words had touched their hearts, how his talks had helped them through their own spiritual challenges. This positive feedback created a perverse incentive system that made the deception even harder to break. My father began to believe, I think, that his addiction was somehow part of his spiritual calling, that his suffering made him a more effective minister, that God was using his weakness to strengthen others. During his brief periods of sobriety, he would talk about how his experiences had given him unique insights into human nature, how his struggles had prepared him to help others who were facing similar battles. He would quote scriptures about God's strength being made perfect in weakness, about how suffering produced endurance and character. The other elders, meanwhile, had developed their own theological framework for understanding and justifying their inaction. They would speak privately about how Satan specifically targeted spiritual leaders, how the most effective servants of God were often the ones who faced the greatest persecution and trials. They would reference biblical examples of flawed leaders whom God had still used for his purposes, pointing to David's adultery and murder, to Solomon's idolatry, to Peter's denial of Christ. In their minds, protecting my father from the consequences of his actions wasn't enabling his addiction. It was showing Christian mercy and understanding. This theological rationalization extended to practical decisions that had real consequences for our congregation. When my father was assigned to serve on judicial committees that dealt with members who had committed serious sins, his impaired judgment led to inconsistent and sometimes harmful decisions. Families were broken apart by harsh disciplinary actions during his worst periods, while serious offenses were overlooked when he was in a drug-induced state of artificial compassion. Young people seeking guidance received confusing and contradictory counsel. Marriage problems were addressed by a man who couldn't maintain stability in his own household for more than a few weeks at a time. Yet through it all, the facade held. At circuit assemblies, my father was still invited to give keynote addresses. At district conventions, those massive 3-day gatherings that brought together thousands of believers, he would deliver talks that were recorded and distributed to congregations across the region. The cognitive dissonance of sitting in those audiences, listening to thousands of people applaud a man I had seen injecting drugs into his veins just hours before, was almost too much to bear. But perhaps you understand, dear listeners, how seductive that applause could be, even for those of us who knew the truth. In those moments, it was almost possible to believe that the man on the stage was the real version of my father, that the broken addict at home was just a temporary manifestation of some spiritual trial that would eventually pass. It was easier to focus on the hope that maybe this time would be different, maybe this talk would mark a turning point, maybe the positive response from the audience would finally give him the strength to overcome his demons permanently. Before I continue with more of this story, I want to pause here and connect with those of you who might be listening. Perhaps you're sitting in your kitchen right now, having your morning coffee, and something about what I've shared is resonating with experiences from your own life. Maybe you've been the child of someone whose public image didn't match their private reality. Maybe you've been part of a community that prioritized reputation over truth or appearance over healing. If that's the case, I want you to know that you're not alone in carrying those complicated feelings, those difficult memories. I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Are you in a small town like the one I grew up in? Or perhaps a big city where anonymity makes it easier to process these kinds of stories? Leave a comment and let me know where this story is reaching you. There's something powerful about knowing that these words are traveling to kitchens and living rooms and car radios across the country, connecting people who might otherwise feel isolated with their experiences. And if this story is bringing up memories or feelings that you've kept buried, please consider sharing them in the comments. Your story matters too, and you never know who might need to hear it. By 1968, when I turned 17, our family's carefully constructed facade was beginning to show cracks that even the most willful blindness couldn't ignore. My father's addiction had progressed to a point where the gaps between his public performances and private reality were becoming shorter and more dangerous. The rehabilitation centers that had once provided temporary respites were no longer effective. He would return from these stays appearing worse than when he left, having learned new methods of obtaining and using substances from other patients rather than developing any genuine recovery skills. The turning point came during what should have been one of our congregation's most celebrated events, the annual visit from the circuit overseer, Brother Maxwell, a man whose authority extended over multiple congregations in our region. These visits happened twice a year and were treated with the same reverence that other communities might reserve for a visit from a governor or senator. Weeks of preparation went into making everything perfect. The Kingdom Hall was cleaned from floor to ceiling, the most talented speakers were selected to give talks, and families competed to host meals and provide accommodations for this important visitor. My father had been chosen to give the keynote address on the theme of maintaining spiritual purity in an immoral world. Indeed, the irony of this assignment wasn't lost on me, but by this point I had learned to compartmentalize these contradictions as a survival mechanism. The night before Brother Maxwell's arrival, my father locked himself in his study to prepare his talk, and I could hear him practicing his delivery through the thin walls. His voice was strong and confident as he rehearsed scriptures about resisting temptation and maintaining moral standards. What I couldn't hear from my bedroom was the sound of him crushing pills and preparing the substances that would carry him through the next day's performance. The morning of Brother Maxwell's visit, everything seemed to be proceeding normally. My father emerged from his study looking impeccable in his best suit, his hair perfectly combed, his Bible and notes organized in his leather briefcase. My mother had prepared an elaborate breakfast, and we sat together as a family, engaging in the kind of pleasant conversation that we had perfected for public consumption. If a stranger had walked into our kitchen that morning, they would have seen the picture of a devout religious family preparing for an important spiritual event. But I knew my father too well by then to miss the subtle signs. His hands had the slight tremor that indicated he was already using something to manage his anxiety. His pupils were dilated despite the bright morning light streaming through our kitchen windows. Most telling of all, he was unusually talkative, launching into lengthy explanations of scriptural points that he planned to cover in his talk, his words coming just a little too quickly, his enthusiasm just a little too forced. The trouble began during the morning session at the Kingdom Hall. Brother Maxwell had arrived the night before and stayed with Brother Patterson's family, as was customary. The meeting opened with songs and prayers, and everything proceeded smoothly through the first few talks given by other congregation members. My father was scheduled to speak just before the lunch break, when the audience would be at its largest and most attentive. When he was introduced, my father walked to the podium with his characteristic confidence. He opened his Bible, adjusted the microphone, and began his talk with a powerful illustration about a man who appeared righteous on the outside, but harbored secret sins. The congregation was immediately engaged, nodding in agreement as he described the dangers of hypocrisy and the importance of authentic spirituality. For the first 10 minutes, his delivery was flawless, passionate but controlled, scripturally sound, personally relevant without being inappropriately intimate. Then something shifted. I was sitting in the third row with my mother and sister, close enough to see the exact moment when whatever substance he had taken that morning reached its peak effect. His speech became more rapid, his gestures more exaggerated, his voice louder and more urgent. He began to deviate from his prepared notes, sharing personal details about spiritual struggles that made the audience uncomfortable. He talked about how Satan could infiltrate even the most dedicated servants of God, how the battle between good and evil could rage within a single person's heart, how sometimes the very people who appeared most spiritual were fighting the darkest battles. Brother Maxwell, who was sitting on the platform behind my father, began to look concerned. Other elders exchanged glances, but my father seemed oblivious to the growing unease in the audience. His talk, which was supposed to last 20 minutes, stretched to 30, then 45 minutes. He began to sweat profusely, his shirt becoming damp and his face flushed. His voice cracked with emotion as he described the anguish of a man who wanted to serve God faithfully, but found himself enslaved by weaknesses he couldn't overcome. Finally, Brother Patterson quietly approached the podium and whispered something to my father. There was a brief moment where my father looked confused, as if he had suddenly awakened from a dream. He looked out at the congregation, seemed to register their uncomfortable expressions for the first time, and abruptly concluded his talk with a stammered prayer. The silence that followed was deafening. During the lunch break, I watched the damage control efforts begin in earnest. Brother Maxwell took the other elders aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly an hour. My mother intercepted congregation members who approached her with concerned questions, explaining that my father had been under tremendous stress due to his heavy responsibilities and might be coming down with something. Sister Jenkins, an elderly woman who had known our family for years, took my hand and asked if everything was all right at home. But before I could answer, Brother Williams appeared and guided her away, engaging her in conversation about the upcoming circuit assembly. The afternoon session proceeded without my father's participation. Brother Maxwell announced that Elder Morrison was feeling unwell and would be resting for the remainder of the day. But I could see that the damage had been done. The carefully maintained illusion of my father's spiritual strength had been compromised in front of the most important authority figure in our religious hierarchy. There would be consequences, and everyone knew it. That evening, after the congregation had dispersed and Brother Maxwell had returned to Brother Patterson's house, my father finally crashed. The combination of whatever he had taken that morning and the adrenaline of his public breakdown left him in a state of complete collapse. My mother and I found him in his study, curled up on the floor behind his desk, sobbing uncontrollably. Between his tears, he kept repeating, "They know now. Everyone knows. It's over." For the first time in my 17 years, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the years of lies and cover-ups and carefully maintained facades were finally coming to an end. Maybe now my father could get the help he really needed, instead of the superficial fixes and temporary solutions that had only enabled his addiction to grow worse over time. But I underestimated the institutional commitment to protecting its own reputation at all costs. The next morning, Brother Maxwell requested a private meeting with our family. We gathered in our living room, the same space where I had performed CPR on my unconscious father just months earlier, and listened as this man, who held tremendous authority over our spiritual lives, laid out the official response to the previous day's events. "Brother Morrison," he began, addressing my father directly, "it's clear that you're facing some significant health challenges that are affecting your ability to fulfill your responsibilities as an elder. The circuit organization has decided that you need an extended period of rest and medical treatment to address these issues." He went on to explain that my father would be temporarily relieved of his elder duties, but that this was being presented to the congregation as a medical leave of absence rather than any kind of disciplinary action. "We believe that with proper treatment and spiritual support, you can overcome these difficulties and return to full service," Brother Maxwell continued. "But for now, the most important thing is your health and recovery." My mother nodded gratefully, tears streaming down her face as she thanked Brother Maxwell for his understanding and mercy. My father, still shaking from the previous day's ordeal, promised to do whatever was necessary to get better. Sarah sat silently beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. But then Brother Maxwell turned his attention to me. "Robert," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I want you to understand something very important. Your father is a good man who is fighting a difficult battle. Sometimes when people are struggling, others might misunderstand their situation or jump to wrong conclusions about what's happening. It would be very harmful to your father's recovery and to your family's well-being if rumors or speculation were to spread in the congregation or the community." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "I'm confident that you understand the importance of supporting your father through this challenging time, rather than doing anything that might make his situation more difficult. The Bible teaches us to bear one another's burdens, and sometimes that means protecting those we love from unnecessary scrutiny or judgment." I understood the message perfectly. This wasn't just a request for discretion. It was a directive to continue the cover-up, now with official authorization from the highest levels of our religious hierarchy. The institution had examined the situation and decided that protecting my father's reputation, and by extension their own credibility, was more important than addressing the underlying problems that had led to his public breakdown. Over the following weeks, the congregation was told that my father was receiving treatment for a rare neurological condition that had been causing erratic behavior and speech difficulties. Well-meaning members sent get-well cards and offered to bring meals to our family. Some even shared stories of their own family members who had dealt with similar medical mysteries, expressing sympathy for how difficult it must be to watch a loved one struggle with such a confusing illness. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Here were sincere, caring people offering genuine support and compassion based on a completely fabricated version of our reality. Their kindness made me feel even more guilty about the deception. But I had been so thoroughly trained in the necessity of maintaining appearances that I couldn't imagine any alternative. Meanwhile, my father's actual condition continued to deteriorate. Without the structure and accountability that his elder responsibilities had provided, his drug use escalated rapidly. The medical treatment he was supposedly receiving consisted primarily of brief stays at detox facilities that did nothing to address the underlying psychological and spiritual issues driving his addiction. Each time he returned home, he was slightly worse than before, more paranoid, more unstable, more dangerous to himself and our family. But the most heartbreaking part of this period was watching how the institutional protection was actually enabling his decline. Because the congregation believed he was dealing with a medical condition rather than behavioral choices, they responded to his erratic behavior with patience and understanding rather than the firm boundaries that might have motivated him to seek real help. When he showed up to meetings clearly impaired, people assumed it was a side effect of his medication. When he made inappropriate comments or behaved strangely, they attributed it to his neurological condition. The very compassion of these good people was being weaponized to protect a lie that was ultimately harmful to everyone involved. As I watched this systematic deception unfold, something fundamental began to shift in my understanding of the religious community I had grown up in. These weren't evil people. Most of them were genuinely trying to do the right thing, to show Christian love and support to a struggling family, but they were operating within a system that prioritized institutional stability over individual healing, that valued reputation over truth, that chose comfortable lies over difficult realities. And at 17 years old, I was beginning to understand that I had a choice to make about whether I would continue to participate in that system or find the courage to seek something more authentic. By the summer of 1969, I had graduated from high school and was facing the most significant decision of my young adult life. The expectation in our religious community was clear. Young men like me were encouraged to become full-time ministers, dedicating our lives to preaching and serving the organization rather than pursuing higher education or worldly careers. For months, the elders had been approaching me with increasing frequency, praising my spiritual maturity and suggesting that I had great potential as a future leader in the congregation. Brother Patterson, who had taken over many of my father's former responsibilities during his medical leave, was particularly persistent in his encouragement. "Robert," he would say after meetings, placing his fatherly hand on my shoulder, "you have a gift for explaining spiritual matters. Your comments during the book study are always so insightful. Have you considered applying to become a regular pioneer?" Regular pioneering meant committing to spend 100 hours per month in door-to-door preaching work, essentially making religious service a full-time occupation. The pressure was immense, but not just from the congregation. My mother, Ruth, had become increasingly dependent on the idea that my spiritual success might somehow compensate for my father's failures. She would show me letters from the regional headquarters praising young men who had dedicated their lives to full-time service, and she would speak wistfully about how proud she would be to have a son serving as a traveling minister or eventually as an elder himself. "It would mean so much to your father," she would say during our private conversations, "to know that despite his struggles, he raised a son who chose to serve Jehovah faithfully." And boon. But I was wrestling with doubts that went far beyond simple career choices. The events of the previous year had forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of truth, authority, and moral responsibility. I had watched my religious community choose comfortable lies over painful realities. I had seen how institutional self-preservation could override genuine care for individuals. Most disturbing of all, I had participated in these deceptions myself, and I was beginning to understand the psychological cost of living a double life. My father's condition had stabilized somewhat by this time, but only in the sense that his decline had reached a kind of plateau. He was no longer attempting to fulfill any official responsibilities in the congregation, which removed the pressure to maintain his public performance. Without that external motivation, he had settled into a routine of managed addiction, using just enough to function, but not so much that he required emergency intervention. It was a fragile equilibrium that required constant monitoring and adjustment, and both my mother and I had become expert at reading the signs and managing the logistics of his daily existence. During this period, I began to have longer and more honest conversations with my father than we had ever shared before. Perhaps because the pressure of maintaining his elder facade had been removed, or perhaps because his addiction had stripped away some of his psychological defenses, he became more willing to acknowledge the contradictions in our family's life. These conversations usually happened late at night when my mother and sister were asleep, and my father was in one of his brief windows of relative clarity between the fog of drugs and the chaos of withdrawal. "I know what you must think of me," he said during one of these midnight talks, his voice barely above a whisper, as we sat in his study surrounded by the religious books and materials that had once been the tools of his leadership. Here I am, a man who spent years teaching others about spiritual discipline and moral purity, and I can't even control my own behavior for more than a few weeks at a time. I didn't know how to respond to this kind of raw honesty from a man I had learned to see as fundamentally unreliable. Part of me wanted to offer comfort and reassurance, to tell him that I understood his struggles and didn't judge him for his failures. But another part of me, the part that had been forced to grow up too quickly by covering for his mistakes and lying to protect his reputation, felt angry and resentful at being put in the position of having to manage an adult's emotional needs while still being treated as a child in every other context. "What I think," I finally said, choosing my words carefully, "is that you're a person who got caught in a system that doesn't know how to deal with real problems." Everyone was so invested in maintaining the image of spiritual leadership that nobody wanted to acknowledge that you needed actual help, not just prayers and temporary solutions. He was quiet for a long time after I said this, staring down at his hands, which bore the telltale marks of his intravenous drug use. When he finally looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. "You're right," he said. "And the worst part is, I let it happen. I knew the system was failing me, failing our family, but I kept participating in it because it was easier than facing the truth about what I had become." These conversations began to crystallize something that had been forming in my mind for months. The problem wasn't just my father's addiction, though that was certainly devastating. The problem was a religious system that was so committed to maintaining perfect appearances that it couldn't handle imperfect realities. It was a community that talked about love and forgiveness, but practiced conditional acceptance and institutional protection. It was a faith that claimed to offer hope and healing, but consistently chose reputation management over genuine recovery. As the fall of 1969 approached, and I was expected to make my decision about pioneering, I found myself doing something I had never done before: reading religious materials from outside our organization. I started with books about addiction and recovery, trying to understand what my father was actually struggling with, rather than accepting the spiritual explanations that had always been offered. What I learned was that addiction is a complex medical and psychological condition that requires professional treatment, not just prayer and willpower. From there, I began to explore different theological perspectives on grace, forgiveness, and human nature. I discovered that many Christian traditions had very different approaches to dealing with sin and failure than what I had grown up with. Some emphasized unconditional love and acceptance rather than performance-based approval. Others focused on systemic justice and social responsibility rather than individual purity and separation from the world. The more I read, the more I realized how narrow and limited my religious education had been. We had been taught that our organization was the only source of spiritual truth, that reading outside materials was dangerous and unnecessary. But I was discovering profound wisdom and insight in books that had never been discussed or referenced in our meetings. I was finding approaches to faith that seemed more compassionate, more realistic about human weakness, and more focused on healing than on judgment. This intellectual awakening was accompanied by an emotional reckoning that was equally significant. I began to recognize how much anger I had been carrying. Anger at my father for his failures, at my mother for her enabling, at the elders for their willful blindness, and at myself for my complicity in the deception. But I also began to understand that this anger, while justified, was becoming toxic if I didn't find a healthy way to process and channel it. I started keeping a journal during this period, writing down my thoughts and feelings without censoring myself for the first time in my life. Page after page filled with questions I had never been allowed to ask, doubts I had never been permitted to express, and observations I had never been encouraged to share. The act of writing gave me a sense of permission to think independently, to form my own opinions, and to trust my own perceptions about what I had experienced. One entry from October 1969 captures the state of mind I was in during this crucial period. Today, Brother Patterson asked me again about pioneering. I told him I was still praying about it, but the truth is, I'm not sure I believe in the kind of God who would want me to spend my life protecting lies and covering up harm. If serving God means perpetuating a system that values reputation over recovery, appearance over authenticity, then maybe I need to find a different way to serve God. Or maybe I need to question whether the God I've been taught about is really God at all. The breakthrough moment came in December 1969, during what was supposed to be a routine visit from the circuit overseer. Brother Maxwell had been replaced by a younger man named Brother Stevens, who brought a different energy to his role. Instead of the careful diplomacy that had characterized previous visits, Brother Stevens seemed more direct in his approach to addressing problems within the congregation. During his private meeting with our family, Brother Stevens asked pointed questions about my father's progress and recovery timeline that hadn't been asked before. He wanted to know specific details about the medical treatment my father was receiving, the doctors he was seeing, and the prognosis for his return to active service. As my mother struggled to provide convincing answers to these more detailed inquiries, I watched the familiar panic begin to set in as our carefully constructed story started to unravel under closer scrutiny. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of jumping in to help maintain the deception, as I had done countless times before, I found myself staying silent. I sat there watching my mother fumble for explanations, watching my father retreat into his characteristic evasiveness, and I felt a strange sense of detachment from the whole performance. It was as if I was watching actors in a play that I no longer wanted to participate in. Finally, Brother Stevens turned to me directly. "Robert," he said, "you're old enough now to understand the serious responsibilities that come with spiritual leadership. Your father's situation has been going on for quite some time, and it's important that we make sure he's getting the help he really needs. Is there anything you think we should know about his condition that might help us provide better support for your family?" This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for through months of reading, writing, and soul-searching. I could have given another rehearsed answer about mysterious medical conditions and ongoing treatments. I could have maintained my role in the family's protective conspiracy. I could have chosen the path of least resistance and continued living the double life that had been modeled for me since childhood. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Brother Stevens, I think my father's problem isn't medical. I think he's been struggling with drug addiction for years, and I think our congregation has been more focused on protecting his reputation than on getting him the kind of professional help that people with addiction actually need." The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. My mother's face went white, and my father looked like he had been physically struck. But Brother Stevens just nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally tell him what he had already suspected. "Thank you for your honesty, Robert," he said calmly. "That kind of courage and integrity is exactly what spiritual maturity looks like. Now we can start talking about real solutions instead of maintaining comfortable illusions." In that moment, something fundamental shifted in my understanding of what faith and spiritual responsibility actually meant. For the first time in my life, telling the truth felt more like serving God than protecting lies had ever felt. For the first time, I experienced what it meant to choose authenticity over appearance, healing over reputation, courage over comfort. It would be many more months before the full implications of that conversation would play out, both for my family and for my own spiritual journey. But as I sat in that room, having finally spoken the truth that had been burning inside me for years, I knew that I had crossed a line that I would never cross back. I had chosen reality over illusion, and there would be no returning to the comfortable deceptions of my childhood. The path forward would be difficult and uncertain, but it would be honest. And after years of living in a world where truth was subordinated to appearance, honesty felt like the most precious gift I could give to myself, to my family, and to whatever understanding of God I might discover beyond the boundaries of institutional protection. The aftermath of my confession to Brother Stevens was unlike anything I could have anticipated. Rather than the explosive confrontation or immediate punishment I had expected, what followed was a period of careful, deliberate action that would fundamentally reshape not only my family's situation, but my entire understanding of what genuine spiritual leadership could look like. Brother Stevens proved to be a man of remarkable wisdom and integrity. Instead of treating my father's addiction as a spiritual failure that needed to be hidden or managed, he approached it as a medical condition that required professional intervention. Within a week of our conversation, he had arranged for my father to be admitted to a specialized treatment facility that dealt specifically with substance abuse among religious professionals, something I hadn't even known existed. This facility, located about 3 hours from our town, took a radically different approach than the detox centers my father had cycled through repeatedly over the years. Instead of focusing solely on the physical aspects of withdrawal and recovery, they addressed the psychological and spiritual factors that had contributed to his addiction in the first place. They worked with religious leaders who had struggled with the unique pressures of maintaining perfect public images while battling private demons. They understood the particular shame and isolation that came with being a spiritual authority figure who had lost control of his own life. For the first time since his addiction had begun, my father was in an environment where honesty was not just permitted, but required for healing. He couldn't hide behind medical euphemisms or spiritual explanations. He had to confront the reality of what he had done to himself and to our family. He had to examine the ways that the religious system itself had contributed to his problems by creating impossible standards and then providing no safe space for admitting failure. The treatment program lasted 6 months, far longer than any of his previous attempts at recovery. During that time, our congregation was told the truth. Not the complete details, but an honest acknowledgement that Elder Morrison was receiving professional treatment for addiction and would not be returning to his leadership position. Some members were shocked, others were disappointed, but many expressed relief that the truth was finally being addressed rather than covered up. My mother initially struggled with this new transparency. For years, she had invested enormous energy in maintaining appearances and protecting secrets. The idea of having our family's problems discussed openly in the community felt like a violation of everything she had worked so hard to preserve. But as the months passed and she began attending support groups for families affected by addiction, she started to understand that secrecy had been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. "I thought I was protecting your father by lying for him," she told me during one of our long conversations that winter. "But I realize now that I was actually enabling him to avoid the consequences of his choices. Every time I covered for him, every story I told to explain away his behavior, I was making it easier for him to continue using drugs rather than harder. As for me, the decision to tell the truth to Brother Stevens marked the beginning of the most challenging and transformative period of my young adult life. The relief I felt at finally breaking the cycle of deception was immense, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of uncertainty about what came next. For 18 years, my identity had been shaped by my role as the elder's son, the future spiritual leader, the young man who was destined to follow in his father's footsteps. With that identity shattered, I had to figure out who I actually was and what I actually believed. I decided to postpone any decisions about religious service and instead enrolled in the local community college to study psychology and social work. This choice was met with disappointment from some congregation members who had expected me to pursue full-time ministry, but Brother Stephen supported my decision completely. Understanding human behavior and learning how to help people in crisis are deeply spiritual pursuits, he told me. There are many ways to serve God, and not all of them involve standing behind a pulpit. My college studies opened up new worlds of understanding about addiction, family systems, and institutional dynamics. I learned about codependency and enabling behaviors, about trauma responses and coping mechanisms. I studied the psychology of religious communities and the ways that spiritual authority can be both helpful and harmful depending on how it's exercised. Every class seemed to provide new insights into my family's experience and new tools for understanding what we had been through. But perhaps more importantly, I discovered a broader Christian community beyond the narrow boundaries of my childhood congregation. I met believers from many different denominations who approached faith with attitudes that were both more questioning and more gracious than what I had known. I encountered theological perspectives that emphasized God's unconditional love rather than conditional approval, that valued authenticity over perfection, that prioritized justice and mercy over reputation management. One professor in particular, Dr. Margaret Thompson, became an important mentor during this period. She had grown up in a fundamentalist religious community herself before becoming a clinical social worker who specialized in helping people recover from religious trauma. She understood the unique challenges faced by individuals who had been raised in high-control religious environments, and she helped me process my own experiences with both professional expertise and personal empathy. The hardest part of recovering from this kind of upbringing, she explained during one of our conversations, is learning to trust your own perceptions and feelings. When you've been taught that questioning authority is sin, when you've been trained to doubt your own instincts in favor of institutional guidance, it takes time to develop confidence in your own moral judgment. Under her guidance, I began to understand that my decision to expose my father's addiction, while painful and disruptive, had actually been an act of moral courage. I had chosen truth over comfort, healing over reputation, love over enablement. These were the values that authentic spiritual maturity was supposed to embody, even when religious institutions failed to model them consistently. My father's recovery was neither quick nor straightforward, but it was genuine in ways that his previous attempts had never been. When he completed the residential treatment program, he returned home as a fundamentally changed person. He was no longer the larger-than-life figure who had dominated our household with his charismatic personality and unpredictable moods. Instead, he was a humble, broken man who was learning to live with honesty and accountability for the first time in decades. He never returned to his position as an elder, and he never sought to regain any kind of formal religious authority. Instead, he found purpose in sharing his story with other religious leaders who were struggling with similar issues. He became involved with the treatment facility where he had recovered, serving as a peer counselor for other clergy members who were battling addiction. His spiritual gifts, which had once been corrupted by his need to maintain false appearances, were redirected toward genuinely helping people find healing and redemption. The relationship between my parents slowly rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. My mother learned to set healthy boundaries and to prioritize truth-telling over reputation management. My father learned to accept responsibility for his choices and to live with the humility that comes from acknowledging profound personal failure. It wasn't the perfect religious family that our congregation had once admired, but it was a real family working through real problems with genuine love and commitment. As for my sister Sarah, who had spent her teenage years retreating into academic achievement to escape the chaos at home, she eventually found her own path toward healing. She pursued a career in addiction counseling, inspired by our family's experience, but determined to approach recovery from a more professional and scientific perspective. She developed expertise in treating addiction within religious communities, and she eventually established her own practice, specializing in helping families affected by substance abuse among spiritual leaders. My own spiritual journey continued to evolve throughout my 20s and 30s. I never returned to the rigid, authoritarian religious framework of my childhood, but neither did I abandon faith altogether. Instead, I discovered a more mature and nuanced understanding of spirituality that could accommodate doubt, questions, and human imperfection. I found Christian communities that valued authentic relationship over perfect performance, that practiced genuine inclusion rather than conditional acceptance, that prioritized social justice and individual healing over institutional preservation. I eventually married a woman named Linda, who had also grown up in a religious environment but had learned to distinguish between healthy spirituality and toxic religiosity. We raised our children with faith, but with a very different approach than what I had experienced. We taught them that it was safe to ask questions, that doubt was a normal part of spiritual growth, that love was unconditional rather than performance-based. We modeled honesty about our own struggles and mistakes, and we never asked them to protect our reputations at the expense of their own emotional well-being. In my professional life, I followed the path that had opened up during my college years, becoming a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in helping individuals and families recover from religious trauma. My personal experience with institutional cover-ups and family secrets gave me unique insight into the dynamics that kept people trapped in unhealthy religious situations. I was able to help clients recognize the signs of spiritual abuse, develop healthy boundaries with religious authorities, and rebuild their faith on more solid foundations. Over the decades, I worked with hundreds of families who were dealing with addiction, abuse, and institutional failure within religious contexts. Some were dealing with sexual misconduct by clergy members, others with financial corruption or authoritarian control. All of them were struggling with the cognitive dissonance that comes from discovering that religious institutions they had trusted were more committed to protecting themselves than to protecting the people they were supposed to serve. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different denominations and religious traditions. When religious leaders failed morally, the institutional response was almost always focused on damage control rather than genuine accountability. Cover-ups were rationalized as protecting the faith community from scandal. Victims were silenced in the name of forgiveness and unity. Offenders were quietly transferred or given new opportunities rather than facing real consequences for their actions. But I also witnessed the tremendous healing that was possible when religious communities chose transparency over secrecy, accountability over protection, authentic love over conditional acceptance. I saw congregations that supported members through addiction recovery rather than shaming them into hiding. I worked with religious leaders who acknowledged their own human limitations and created space for others to do the same. I experienced faith communities that understood that spiritual maturity meant facing difficult truths rather than maintaining comfortable illusions. Now at 72 years old, I look back on that pivotal moment in Brother Stephen's living room when I chose to tell the truth about my father's addiction, and I see it as the beginning of my real spiritual journey. Everything before that moment was preparation. Painful, necessary preparation that taught me the difference between genuine faith and religious performance, between authentic love and institutional loyalty, between spiritual maturity and rule following. The path I chose was not easier than the path of continued deception would have been. It required years of difficult self-examination, professional therapy, and careful reconstruction of my understanding of God, faith, and community. It meant disappointing people who had expected me to follow a predetermined script for spiritual success. It meant accepting uncertainty and complexity rather than the black and white answers that religious fundamentalism had offered. But it was a path that led to genuine freedom, authentic relationships, and meaningful service to others who were struggling with similar challenges. It was a path that honored both the reality of human brokenness and the possibility of genuine redemption. It was a path that allowed me to serve God by serving truth, rather than serving institutions that claimed to represent God, but too often represented only themselves. To those of you who have listened to this entire story, thank you for accompanying me on this journey through some of the most difficult and transformative experiences of my life. If any part of this narrative has resonated with your own experiences, whether with addiction in your family, with religious institutions that prioritized reputation over healing, or with the challenge of choosing authenticity over appearances, I want you to know that you're not alone in carrying these burdens. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from today? Have you or someone you love struggled with similar challenges? Have you found yourself in situations where telling the truth felt dangerous, but remaining silent felt even more harmful? Your stories matter, and sharing them can provide hope and healing for others who might be facing similar crossroads. This story you've just heard represents the real experience of one of our channel subscribers who found the courage to share his journey with all of us. If you have a story of overcoming religious trauma, family addiction, or institutional betrayal that you think might help others feel less alone in their struggles, please consider sharing it in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from realizing that our experiences, as painful as they may have been, can serve as beacons of hope for others who are still finding their way out of darkness and into the light of authentic truth and genuine freedom.